My name is Christophe Cornu. I work in the section of health and education at UNESCO, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this meeting today on bullying involving children and young people with disabilities, co-organized by UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum. So before I introduce the first speakers and say a few words about the objectives, I would like to make a few practical announcements on communications during the meeting. First, please note that today there is interpretation available in 3 languages: English, French, and Spanish, and also international sign language. So for international sign language, you should be able to see the international sign language interpreter on the screen. And otherwise, you can find the language you prefer by clicking on the globe icon, which is at the bottom of the screen, as shown on the slide. So if you have questions and comments during the meeting, you can use the Q&A function. You can include your questions and comments. Please introduce yourself briefly with your name, name of your organization or country. And if your question or comment is directed to a specific panelist, please indicate to which panelist the question or the comment is directed. So there is no access to the chat function. However, our team will post some information, resources in the chat function. So please keep an eye on it. And I also want to mention that the meeting is recorded in the 3 languages. So for people who don't have a chance to follow it live today. So now let's move to the objectives of the meeting. So today we will share evidence coming from a literature review that was commissioned by UNESCO, and these findings will be presented for the first time today. And we will try to basically answer the following questions. What do we know about the scope and the nature of bullying involving learners with all types of disabilities? What does the evidence say about effective interventions to tackle bullying affecting learners with disabilities? And this will be done through live presentations with 2 speakers and messages from young people with disabilities. And as I indicated before, speakers will be able to answer your questions and address your comments. And then, because we feel very strongly about youth involvement at UNESCO, we thought that would be also very important to look at another issue. And we will discuss how research involving young people with disabilities can help build evidence on the effectiveness of interventions. This will be done through an interactive panel discussion with 3 speakers without presentations, to whom I will ask questions, and they will also be able to answer your questions. So without further ado, I will now welcome the representatives from the 2 co-organizers of this event, UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum, for the opening remarks. The representative of UNESCO is Mrs. Vibeke Jensen. She's the director of the Division for Peace and Sustainable Development in the education sector at UNESCO. And then we will hear a message recorded by Frida Wang, who is the managing director of the World Anti-Bullying Forum. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today, but she has pre-recorded a message. So now the floor is yours, Vibeke, please.
Thank you so much, Christophe, and good afternoon and good morning, good evening, everyone. It is indeed my great pleasure to welcome you all to this 3rd international meeting on bullying, which is co-organized by UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum. We have joint efforts and launched a series of virtual international thematic meetings designed as a direct follow-up to the International Conference on School Bullying that we organized last year together with the French Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports. Now, these meetings seek to share new evidence and stimulate debates and exchange good practices to advance more effective responses to school violence and bullying. The first meeting, held a few months back, focused on responding to bullying effectively, using a whole education approach, as also described in the recommendations by the scientific committee who prepared the international conference in 2020 that we did together with the French ministry. The second meeting contributed to a better understanding of what bullying is, and it will also lead to a revised definition of bullying and cyberbullying that will be presented during the World Anti-Bullying Forum to be held later this year in November, I think. Preventing and addressing school bullying, and more broadly, all forms of school violence, is very much at the core mandate of the education sector at UNESCO. We have plenty of evidence on the negative consequences of school violence and bullying on the education and health and well-being of children and young people. Those who are targeted by violence, bystanders, perpetrators, and at the end of the day, the whole school community. Because of all these very well documented negative consequences, reaching from missing classes, school dropout, lower academic performances, etc., school violence in all its forms, including bullying, is a severe infringement of children's and adolescents' right to education. It is an obstacle to their right to learn in safe and inclusive environments, which is a right that all countries have committed to secure by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Violence in schools is not a phenomenon that affects only a few children in some countries. Global data on the prevalence of bullying shows that almost 1 in 3 students has been bullied by their peers at school at least once over the last months. And in some regions, it's over 40%. For many years, UNESCO has supported our member states in responding to school violence and bullying. However, during the last 10 years or so, we have intensified our efforts. We have been leading the efforts in generating more knowledge on this topic so that our member states have the evidence they need to make decisions. That's what we did, for example, by releasing in 2019 a really groundbreaking report called Behind the Numbers: Ending School Violence and Bullying, which compiles and analyzes the most comprehensive, up-to-date, and relevant data on school violence and bullying. We have been paying particular attention to school violence that is based on or related to gender. UNESCO was, for example, the first UN agency to focus on school violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, showing that LGBTIQ learners are very much targeted by bullying. We have also documented promising and good practices worldwide to help ministries of education and also other stakeholders design evidence-based responses to school violence, including that violence based on gender. Based on the good practices we documented, we developed, for example, the global guidance on addressing school-related gender-based violence in collaboration with UN Women. We have decided to expand our work by exploring other drivers of school violence and bullying that affect certain groups of learners beyond sexual orientation and gender identity and gender in general. And today we will present the evidence on one of those drivers, namely disabilities. We will hear how learners with disabilities are particularly affected by bullying and by what type of bullying. Later this year, we'll also present data on another driver of bullying, namely migration. I'm personally very excited about this meeting as it relates to an important area of work, inclusive education, As many of you will know, UNESCO promotes inclusive education systems that remove the barriers limiting the participation and achievement of all learners. Systems that respect diverse needs, abilities, and characteristics, and systems that eliminate all forms of discrimination in the learning environment. We work with governments and partners to address exclusion from and inequality in education. Among marginalized and vulnerable groups, UNESCO has been paying special attention to children with disabilities as they are overrepresented amongst those who are not in education. With that, I once again welcome you all to this important meeting. I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting afternoon session and a fruitful discussion over the next two hours or so. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And back to you, Christoph.
So we will listen now to the message by Frida Wang. Thank you, Vibeke.
Hello, my name is Frida Wang, and I am the Managing Director of the World Anti-Bullying Forum. We are very glad that all of you could join us today at this joint World Anti-Bullying Forum and UNESCO event. The World Anti-Bullying Forum is an international and multidisciplinary forum whose purpose is to broaden our understanding of bullying, harassment, discrimination, ostracism, and other forms of violence among and against children and youth. This November, the Swedish NGO Friends and the Norwegian Partnership Against Bullying are organizing the World Anti-Bullying Forum in Stockholm, Sweden, as a hybrid event with the possibility to attend both online and on-site. Please visit the website worldanti-bullyingforum.com to see the program and the amazing keynotes, and not least to register. We want you all there. The forum is a setting for multidisciplinary and cross-level dialogues aimed at improving our understanding of bullying in all settings where children spend time, and efforts to stop it and prevent it. So that is why we are very happy that we have this collaboration with UNESCO and this series of virtual meetings. We believe that if research-based knowledge is shared among those who work with and for children and those who influence children's living conditions, we have a better chance of effective bullying prevention. Therefore, the World Anti-Bullying Forum is a place for dialogue among researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and other stakeholders. And as we all know, anyone can be subjected to bullying. But we also know that some groups are at greater risks of being subjected than others. In schools and other learning settings, social stigma and negative attitudes toward learners with disabilities can make children and young people with all types of disabilities more vulnerable to bullying, which is an infringement on their rights to education and a violation against the Convention of the Rights of the Child. That is why we are particularly glad that all of you is joining us today, so we can look closer on this important subject. It is vital that young people with disabilities are themselves involved in research on bullying. They are the experts. They know about their own reality. This means we can have an improved evidence-based response to bullying, and we will hear more about that today. We are very much looking forward to today's agenda and to continue this dialogue at the World Anti-Bullying Forum in November. We want this event today to stimulate debates that will contribute to the preparation of the World Anti-Bullying Forum and continue at the Forum Days in November. We look forward to seeing you all at the third World Anti-Bullying Forum, and we welcome you to Stockholm. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Vibeke Jensen and to Frida Wang for positioning this meeting within the broader context of what UNESCO and the World Anti-Bullying Forum are doing in relation to bullying. So before we listen to the presentation on the evidence that comes up from the literature review we commissioned, first we would like to hear to those who are directly affected by bullying. And we will listen to Maria Jerry talking about her experience and thoughts about bullying. Maria is a goodwill ambassador from the Cerebral Palsy Society of Kenya, and she's a passionate advocate for the rights of persons with cerebral palsy. She's also an activist with the UK-based NGO Leonard Shisher. So we'll listen to Maria, and then we'll go into the live presentation. Thank you.
My name is Maria Jerry from Nairobi, Kenya. I am a diversity and inclusion expert. Bullying in any form for a child with a disability is a very traumatic experience, lasting to affect them all through their life. And bullying and school violence isn't always physical. Mental and emotional bullying appears to be just as present as physical bullying, and in many cases it has a deeper and longer effect. Unfortunately, I remember my learners didn't know much about me and my condition, and so they laugh at me all the time and make sarcastic comments. I remember being isolated in my own desk, away from the others, and locked up in class, always teased for not managing my schoolwork. And then they realized I didn't have a good balance, and I'd frequently roll down the staircases. However, the teachers were not any better, and would frequently punish me for not keeping up with the schoolwork. One particular day is I came home when my fingers were really sore and the back of my thighs were red with pinch marks. I believe if the school and the teachers had introduced me appropriately, it would have been easier. School would have been a much pleasant experience. Awareness packed with information and knowledge tackles the fear of the unknown and finds common attributes for all the children.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if Maria is with us today or if we have friends from Kenya. I really want to thank you again for this testimony. And so now we're going to move to the presentation of the findings. I just want to give you a bit of background before we listen to the presenters. So as Vibeke Jensen mentioned a few minutes ago, in 2019, UNESCO published a report called Behind the Numbers, Ending School Violence and Bullying. And we felt that there was a major gap on the nature, in terms of data, on the nature, the scope of violence and bullying affecting learners with disabilities. even if we were told that this is a population really vulnerable to bullying and school violence in general. So last year, we decided to commission a specific literature review on this topic. And we were lucky to have Stephen Meyers and Megan Klosky and the team from the University of Washington in the US working with us on the literature review. They not only conducted a literature review, they also consulted with a number of key informants, including through a series of focus group discussions, conducting with young people with disabilities in various regions in the world. And so now we're going to listen to Megan Masklowski. She's a senior fellow at the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative at the University of Washington. She will present the key findings, and with her, we will also have Xixin Huang. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and she conducted some of the focus group discussions in China. And I also want to mention that during the presentation, we will hear firsthand testimony from one of the participants in one of those focus group discussions. And as I said before, after the presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers. So now the floor is yours, Megan. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christophe, and thank you to everyone who supported this study. I'm really delighted to share some of the findings with you today. It's probably unnecessary for this audience, but for any of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of bullying, it refers to intentional and aggressive behavior occurring repeatedly against a victim where there is a real or perceived power imbalance and where the victim feels vulnerable and powerless to defend himself or herself. The unwanted behavior can be physical, which includes hitting, kicking, the destruction of property. It could also be verbal, such as teasing, insulting, threatening, sexually harassing, or relational through the spreading of rumors and exclusion from a group. Next slide, please. For children with disabilities, they are already vulnerable in a number of settings. We know from the evidence that children with disabilities are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience violence at some point in their lives, whether at home, at school, in their communities, or in other settings. Next slide. So the purpose of this study was to understand what is known about bullying against children and young persons with disabilities in school settings. The report is based on a rapid review of the literature on school violence and bullying involving students with disabilities. And we had intentionally adopted an intersectional lens and analyzed the ways in which socio-demographic and environmental factors such as gender, age, family disadvantage, disability type, and learning setting could affect vulnerability to bullying. When we put the research team together, we also prioritized including students with disabilities and asked students to facilitate focus group discussions among their peers and with recent university graduates to get their input into the findings and recommendations. In all, the project involved 70 young people with diverse disabilities in different locations, including South Africa, China, Bangladesh, Jamaica, Nigeria, Indonesia, and the US. Next slide. The study identified a number of significant gaps in available evidence. Among the most striking is the geographic concentration of relevant research. Nearly half of the 300 relevant studies exclusively used data originating in North America, most of those in the US. And an additional 25% of the studies drew on data from Western Europe, which means that 3 out of 4 studies came from the global North. The remaining articles from Asia and the Pacific, Africa, Central and South America, and the Middle East included regions where certain countries were overrepresented. So for example, in Asia Pacific, Australia represents nearly half of the articles, and South Africa represents nearly half of those from sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. In addition to a lack of geographic distribution, nearly all of the studies reviewed rely on data from high-income countries. So just 2%, or 5 articles total, focused on low-income countries, and 4 of these were from Uganda. Lower middle income and upper middle income countries represented just 4% and 8% of the remaining research. which suggests that we're missing, we're not even close to capturing the experiences of students with disabilities in the global South. And next slide, please. There's also significant gaps in the evidence relating to particular issue areas and populations. So there's insufficient data on the scale and nature of the problem of bullying, in particular data that is comparable across countries and that's disaggregated by age, gender, and type of disability. Students with disabilities are diverse, and findings regarding prevalence show differences that depend in part on how disability is being defined in any given study and which students with disabilities are included. So there's a need for more data that's comparable and uses similar definitions. There's also little research into identifying and evaluating interventions to prevent school violence and bullying in diverse learning settings. Very little information about what works. There's little information into the intersection of gender and disability, especially with regard to vulnerability to bullying, as well as the role of gender norms relating to perpetration of bullying, particularly the desire to be seen as conforming to heterosexual norms in particular that may be driving bullying by boys and young men with disabilities. And there's next to no research on LGBTQI learners with disabilities and their experiences of bullying. Data on the experiences of college-age students is also limited, college-age students with disabilities. And there's very little research into the risks of cyberbullying, which is particularly relevant given this current environment. And we know little about what works in terms of technological and other tools of prevention. Despite these gaps, we can still learn quite a lot from the research that has been done. Next slide, please. With regard to overall prevalence, findings of prevalence of bullying experienced by learners with disabilities do vary substantially depending on the research designs. However, in every study reviewed for this report, the students with disabilities included in the study were at least as likely and usually far more likely to be victims of school violence and bullying. And this was true at every level of schooling, from early childhood to primary, secondary, and higher education, and for every form of bullying. So for example, in one study in Finland, preschool age children between the ages of 3 and 6 years old with special educational needs were more than twice as likely to be victims of bullying and 4 times as likely to be both bullies and victims as their non-disabled peers. Primary school children in a study in South Korea, primary school children with autism spectrum disorder were more than 4 times as likely to be victims of bullying than their peers without disabilities. And in a national sample of bullying among primary and secondary school students in the US, 1 in 4 primary students with disabilities had experienced bullying compared to just 15% of their non-disabled peers. At the secondary level, that rate rose to more than 1 in 3 students with disabilities victimized by bullying. And as I noted, there's little comparative data on learners in higher education, learners with disabilities. University students in our focus groups in South Africa, China, Indonesia, and the United States all reported multiple instances of bullying on their respective campuses, from peers and from faculty questioning their ability to keep up, to refusals to permit or approve necessary accommodations, and from exclusion from social activities. Next slide, please. This is an example from one of the few cross-country comparisons, which in this case involved more than 55,000 primary and secondary students across 11 countries in Europe. And in this case, students with disabilities or chronic illness reported higher rates of peer victimization in every single country. And in some cases, the rates were almost double. I should note that although the majority of research tends to focus on learners with disabilities as victims of bullying, there is also some evidence that students with disabilities are overrepresented among both bullies and bully victims. In a study involving more than 1,000 fifth grade students in the US, the researchers found that American fifth grade boys with disabilities were 3 times, and girls with disabilities were nearly 5 times more likely to be perpetrators and victims of bullying than boys and girls without disabilities, but were no more likely to be a bully absent previous victimization, which suggests that students with disabilities may become bullies as a learned or defensive response to being bullied themselves. The next slide, please. The study sought to identify factors that research indicates may increase the risk of bullying. There's few comparative studies analyzing students' involvement with school violence and bullying that disaggregate by disability type. However, those that do find higher rates of victimization among students with disabilities, with particular disabilities. Students with emotional disturbances, intellectual disabilities, communication difficulties, and multiple disabilities tend to report the highest rates of victimization compared with both non-disabled students and students with other disabilities. In a national assessment of the prevalence of bullying victimization among students with disabilities in the US, which measured rates at the elementary, middle, and secondary school levels and compared students with different disability types, researchers found that students with emotional disturbances were bullied at a significantly higher rate than the overall victimization rate for students with disabilities at all levels of schooling. And at secondary level, they were the only group with a higher rate of victimization than the overall rate of students with disability for all students with disabilities. Researchers have also found that the risk of repeated victimization varies by disability type, and students with autism in elementary and middle school are at the greatest risk of repeated victimization, while at the secondary level, students with orthopedic impairments are most at risk relative to other students with disabilities. It's also important to note here that this reflects categories, the research at this point reflects categories that are dominant in the countries that are doing the research. So disabilities such as albinism do not figure in the academic literature, which is a significant limitation. Next slide, please. Other significant risk factors include a prior experience of victimization, poverty, and family disadvantage, and learning setting. In a longitudinal study in the US involving more than 4,000 students with disabilities between the ages of 6 and 13, researchers found that a prior history of victimization was the greatest predictor of bullying victimization across time, more so than age, household income, disability type, or social competence. Once a student had been bullied, they were 5 times more likely to be bullied again. Poverty and family disadvantage are also significant factors. Low income and food insecurity increase vulnerability to bullying for students with disabilities, as did low education levels and disabilities among parents. The data on school settings or learning context is difficult to analyze, in part because of the wide variation among school settings and the lack of clarity on how they are defined in the literature. However, there is evidence that learners with disabilities are as likely to experience bullying in mainstream schools as in special schools, and are particularly vulnerable in residential and institutional settings. In other words, there's no setting in which students with disabilities are less likely to experience bullying. There is data suggesting that attending schools with peers with disabilities can increase students' resilience to victimization or maybe make it less likely. Where students with disabilities have few friends and little peer support, they are more likely to report being victimized. Next slide, please. So bullying in school can have significant consequences and impede learners with disabilities' access to education. Although this was not a focus of our study, we heard in the focus groups that among many students that their parents were reluctant to send the children to school for fear they would be bullied, that bullying caused significant psychological harm and emotional harm, and that bullying at the hands of teachers and fellow students so undermined students' confidence and experience at school that they dropped out or were consistently absent. And one of our key informants, who is an activist for students with albinism in South Africa, said that bullying in school is worse than community violence because it breaks a significant part of you. It gets at your abilities. It is some form of a barrier to a full life, which affects your future earnings, your independence, how you see the world, as all of those depend on getting a formal education. It's one of the cruelest forms of violence, as it denies you belonging and learning. And I remind my students all the time that the data that we look at is behind that data. There is real people and their experiences. And so I'd like to share with you a testimonial from one of the young women that we met in the course of this research.
经毕业，目前在家专职考研的残障青年。今天我将跟大家分享一下我个人的经历。我的左眼是失明且伴有斜视症状，因此我校园欺凌的事件呢，大部分发生在初中时期。第一件事呢，主要是在我初中军训之后，有一个坐在我前面的男生突然回过头来，笑嘻嘻的盯着我瞅，然后就说：“哎，你眼睛好像是斗鸡眼儿哎。”然后他就会将他的这个发现，大肆宣扬，然后呼朋引伴的向周围的其他同学宣扬：“你们快看呀，他是斗鸡眼儿哎。”然后他就把这个外号，他会把这个称呼作为我的外号，每当遇到我的时候都会说斗鸡眼儿，斗鸡眼儿，就是那种恶意的笑容。第二个男生呢，他是在我做值日的时候，无所事事的晃悠过来，忽然在我旁边面前站定，就说：“我要是像你这样啊，我可活不下去。”接着呢，他就很认真的对我来了一句：“哎，你怎么不去死呢？”你想象不到一个初中的孩子，这两位初中的男孩可以说出这样的话来。尽管我们认为他们是缺少成年人或者缺少一些理性的思考，但是他们有了自我的是非观念，甚至在一定程度上可以承担一定的法律责任。为什么还能说出这样的话呢？我认为究其原因，可能是在家庭教育的缺失上。也就是说，我们非残障的父母及其他们的儿童该如何去减少对残障青年的偏见呢？我认为在社会上可以去开设一些如同当下比较流行的分娩体验中心和濒死体验中心的一种叫残障青年生活体验中心，让这种非残障的青年和他们的父母去更好的体会一下我们残障青年生活中的种种，以减少他们对残障青年的一种偏见。第二点就是，正如我上面两个例子，我所受到的校园欺凌，主要就是来自于同龄群体他们的恶意。那么，如何去减少我们其他像我一样的其他的残障青年他所受到的恶意呢？那么，我认为可以从内部入手，可以组织可以组织一些反校园暴力或反欺辱残障青年的小组、社团和活动，去减少我们非残障青年或者说其他人对于残障青年的一种校园欺凌事件。最后一点就是，很多残障青年的父母都是健全人，但是并不是所有人能够幸运的得到所有父母的关爱、关心和爱护。因此，我们是否应该去提高一下我们残障青年的非残障父母的对他们的爱护以及他们的了解呢？以上就是我个人的一些简单的分享和我的建议，感谢各位倾听。
Shishin, the floor is yours now, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan, for showing this video. And in my presentation, I will share findings and testimonies such as what Li Jun just said in our focus group discussion. And hopefully it can give us a glimpse into the voices and lived experiences of children and young people with disability in school. Next slide, please. From our focus group interview, we found that school bullying goes hand in hand with discrimination against learners with disability. Through the narrative of group members, we found that bullying perpetrators frequently target the atypical impairments of those with disability as abnormality, weakness, and vulnerability in bullying behavior. For example, Li Zi, a woman with dwarfism, mentioned that people imitated the way I walk on purpose and made everyone laugh. Next slide. And another, a woman with autism, also mentioned that I have challenge in motor coordination and ran very slowly. Other students would take my belongings and run quickly. I ran after them slowly and then they stopped for a while. Then when I almost caught up, they would run again. I could never catch up in this way. This kind of teasing made me feel very bad. Next slide. And a woman with visual disability sector, she said that because I couldn't see the blackboard clearly from my seat, I had to go in front of the classroom after a class to write down what the teacher wrote on the blackboard. Some boys were so bad that they ran ahead of me on purpose to wipe the chalk writing of the teacher. Experience like this highlight the ways in which atypical bodies and mind and their unique ways of learning and living are deeply stigmatized and devalued by their peers, which further perpetuate physical, emotional, and relational violence against them. The rules of school bullying against children and youth with disability is not a making of disability itself, but is a product of ableism within the education system and school environment in which disabled body and minds are devalued as abnormality. Next slide. We found a variety of forms of bullying behavior that echo with existing literature on school bullying. This includes physical abuse such as beating and damaging personal belonging. We also heard a lot of examples of psychological abuses from participants' narrative. Almost all participants reported that they were called names by their peers that devalue their impairments, the way they walk, sign, talk, learn, and even live. Verbal abuses such as what Li Jun said, "You are already like this, why don't you kill yourself?" were also constantly encountered by participants. Group members were also socially excluded by their peers in playground and in classroom. In our focus group, cyberbullying was mentioned by one participant. A female participant with autism also testified that she was subjected to sexual harassment constantly that devalued and undermined her dignity in secondary school. I quote 2 examples of this bullying behavior here. Next slide. Jiao Yang, a girl with scoliosis, said that my body looked different than other kids. There were 2 boys in my class who would bully me without any reason. For example, they dragged my head during break. Teacher didn't intervene at all. The most severe time was that they pushed me down on the ground and kept kicking me. I was just lying on the ground and let them kick on me. I became so frightened that I didn't dare to go to school. Physical abuses as severe as what Jiao Yang experienced was not uncommon among group members. Disabled students were beaten, had their personal belongings such as pens, books, and backpacks shown or damaged by peer, and one participant even reported that fellow students poured insecticide into her backpack because they felt she was dirty and tainted as a person with disability. Next slide. The example was from Fei Fei, a person with autism. She said that when boys saw me, they acted like they saw the god of plague. They saw my belonging like they had virus. Classmates even pour insecticide into my backpack. All this lived experience of bullying told us painful story about how children and youth with disability have been systematically devalued, stigmatized, and marginalized in school that was supposed to nurture and support them. Next slide. Participants reported that gender intersect with their disability identity to shape the experience of school bullying. These intersectionalities both exist in bullying victimization and perpetuation. Group members reported that disabled girls are more likely to become victims of bullying. While boys with disability can also experience bullying, they are more likely to fight back the perpetrator as a form of masculinity performance in school. For example, Zhihan, a deaf man, signed that when I was in first grade, a boy who was quite fat always beat me. He also led other students to beat me together. Then I got very angry and punched into his mouth. His tooth dropped out because of my punch. Then students were afraid and they didn't dare to beat me together again. In terms of gender difference in perpetuation, a girl with cerebral palsy mentioned that gender definitely makes a difference. There have always been more boys than girls who bully me. When I grew up, there were much more boys who bullied me with physical action. From hers and others' narrative, boys are more likely to perpetuate bullying behavior, particularly in physical form. Next slide. we unravel what kind of contextual factor that mediate the occurrence, severity, and consequences of school bullying. And participants identify these 5 most important contextual factors. First of all, they generally identify teacher and the school as the most important contextual factor. However, it is very sad that most of them reported that teachers often fail to intervene in bullying, even though disabled students repeatedly report to them. Also, teachers are not capable of handling school bullying because they have little experience interacting with disabled students and do not know how to tackle their special education needs. And also, family is identified by participants as a factor. They both report positive and negative experience of family's intervention. However, parents of disabled students might ignore their children's help seeking because of the parents' own negative conception of disability. A participant identified that the long-lasting culture of collectivism that discourages individual difference as a cultural ideology that excludes disabled people as an equal member of society and in school. And lastly, students with disability from rural areas are more vulnerable to school bullying because of poorer school infrastructure, teachers' lack of knowledge and experiences in handling special education needs, and the lack of public awareness of disability. Next slide.
Just a reminder that you have 8 minutes left for the overall presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I will finish here. So from this focus discussion, participants recognize that experts and practitioners of the field should not only see disability as a risk factor of bullying victimization. More importantly, we should recognize how disabling social environment and stigma perpetuate, justify, and reinforce school bullying upon children and youth with disability. In this process, it is of fundamental importance to listen to the voices and lived experience of young people themselves as sources of knowledge, agents of change, and inventor of solution. I will end my presentation with a quote from a woman with autism. I think the school should have a cultural change that not everyone is supposed to be the same, quite the contrary, everyone should be different and learn to live together with people who are different. Thank you.
Thank you, Shisin. So UNESCO's developed.
You can continue before the questions. Please go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. UNESCO's developed a framework, which is the whole education approach, which captures the key areas of intervention required to prevent and address school violence and bullying. To ensure that the whole education approach is also effective for learners with disabilities, each area of intervention or component of the framework should incorporate the principles of inclusive education and be sensitive to the needs of children and young people living with disabilities. I'm not going to go through each of the elements here. They're discussed in the technical brief prepared by UNESCO based on the findings in the report, as well as in the full report. But there's 2 components I would like to focus on: inclusive school cultures and student participation. Next slide, please. In stakeholder interviews and focus groups, when we asked what was most needed to reduce bullying against students with disabilities, participants nearly universally pointed to creating inclusive school cultures in which students with disabilities would be treated as valued members of the school community. Data in the literature back this up. Some studies have shown that where teachers encourage students with and without disabilities to play together, students with disabilities are less likely to be bullied. Where schools are also strict about responding to bullying and intervening, students with disabilities report better experiences. In one study comparing bullying in deaf schools, researchers found much higher rates of victimization than those among hearing students in mainstream schools. But they also found that the teachers were much less likely to intervene in the deaf schools compared with the mainstream schools, so they concluded that it wasn't the students, but it was rather the failure of the adults to act promptly that allowed bullying to continue. Next slide, please. Researchers have also found that children and young people with disabilities are less likely than their non-disabled peers to disclose experiences of violence and bullying, and are less likely to recognize abusive behavior as violence or as bullying. So adopting accessible feedback mechanisms that are confidential and age appropriate, such as comment boxes, can make it more likely that students with disabilities will disclose school violence and bullying when it occurs. Stakeholders also pointed out the need for involvement of students with disabilities in student activities, including student committees, extracurricular activities, and student leadership. When students with disabilities are recognized as active members of the school community, it reduces stigma, increases awareness of violence and bullying, and the levels of overall peer abuse go down. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll look forward to discussing the findings further. I will say that you can find the technical brief on Unesco's website, and the full report is available on the Brown Dog LLC website, and it will be soon available on the University of Washington website. I'll share those links in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan and Shishin. So now we will have time for questions and answers. I really liked your presentation because, I mean, you provided some very compelling statistics at the very beginning of the presentation. I have to say, it's really the first time I see so much data in a single place. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we decided to commission this literature review, even if obviously you mentioned that most of the data comes only from a few regions. I think it's still really valuable. And what I liked about this presentation is not just about statistics. As you mentioned, young people, children with disabilities are not statistics. And what was really great about Shishin's presentation is that we could really listen to all these examples of different situations of bullying. So we have a question. I have also a few questions for you, but I can see your question in the Q&A. So the question is, do teachers need to have specialized training to deal with disability bullying or LGBTQ bullying? It seems as though the first steps need to be taken in schools. So what would you say about teacher training and specific teacher training?
So I would say a couple of things. On the one hand, training is a great idea. And I would say in this case, not only teachers, but whole school staff, because oftentimes bullying can come from the janitor, the school cleaning staff, administrators, school leadership, and so on. So it seems to be something that should be addressed by the whole school and not stop at the school boundaries either, be something that is extended to parents and parent-teacher organizations and so on. But I will also say this. One of the key informant stakeholders that we spoke with described an example of a school that she had visited in West Africa, in which there was a child who was deaf, and the teacher there had no specialized training. None of the students did as well, but she just created an environment in which that child was as welcome, as valued as every other child. And her comment to us was that it takes will. That's all it takes, is really the will, the interest, the engagement, and so on. And so yes, on the one hand, training is a great thing. On the other hand, we can do a lot without it.
Okay, so I don't see other questions for now, so please don't hesitate to post your questions in the Q&A. I have a question for you on cyberbullying. We know that cyberbullying is a form of bullying that is increasing, even if the data on the prevalence of cyberbullying is lacking at global level. What can you say about cyberbullying affecting children, learners with disabilities? I know you mentioned this like when you were talking about the data gaps, but can you say a bit more about cyberbullying?
Sure. Yeah, there have been a few studies on cyberbullying involving students with disabilities, and those suggest similar patterns to traditional forms of bullying. So, for example, in a series of 3 studies, and I think these were all in Israel, they compared adolescents with learning disabilities or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder with non-disabled students. And researchers found that students with disabilities were more likely to be victims, perpetrators, and witnesses to cyberbullying. with girls with disabilities the most likely to be victims, but also the most likely to be perpetrators and victims. And so there was another study among college students where the recognizability of an online user's disability status or the availability of knowledge that they were receiving academic accommodations increased the victimization risk. So there's not a whole lot of data, but what it is what is there does suggest similar patterns.
Okay, I also have a question. I know you touch lightly on this, but we know that children with disabilities study in many different types of learning settings, mainstream schools, special schools, residential institutions. So can you tell us a bit more about the evidence about the exposure to bullying depending on where children with disabilities learn? Are there any significant differences?
So the most significant difference is with respect to learners with disabilities who are in institutions or who are in residential settings. And I'm going to make a caveat to that, because what is a residential school is a matter of it's something of a spectrum. And so there is considerable evidence that being in an institution can increase substantially the risk of violence for children with disabilities, in part because they're separated from a community, there's very little accountability, there's very little transparency. To a lesser degree, the same may be true of students in residential settings that are termed schools. But I will also say that we heard from members of our focus groups that being in a special school setting was actually allowed them to do things like play sports. They talked about, some of the students in South Africa talked about playing soccer and not having to explain how to play soccer with them. They were blind, and being able to play with their peers and not really having to be different in that setting. However, students in the deaf school in Jamaica, for example, talked about bullying happening within their school among students who did not understand, say, Jamaican Sign Language, or didn't have as nice clothes. And so what we see, it's sort of hard to parse, but what you see is that there's no setting that is particularly protective.
Understood. We have two very interesting questions coming from two participants. So there's one which is related to reporting, and in the whole education approach you described, reporting is a very important element of the response. So here, the question is, what reporting system should schools have to be able to act against bullying? And here, I would make it more specific, because reporting about bullying is one thing, but here, the question I would ask you is, reporting against bullying targeting children with disabilities, and especially for learners with disabilities themselves, to be able to report incidents of bullying, either if they are victims or incidents of bullying that they witness.
That's a really good question. And I don't know that there's any particular one model, but the factors that came up in the conversations that we had and in the literature are that it's essential that it be gender sensitive. So recognizing that girls with disabilities may feel less empowered to speak up in any kind of a setting. They may also feel like they won't be listened to if they do speak up. And so make sure whatever mechanism you do use recognizes that there are different venues in which girls in particular, but all students with disabilities may feel more or less comfortable speaking out, that it needs to be confidential, because students talked often about how having reported bullying just made it worse. And so they didn't get any resolution, and it just created bigger problems, so they wouldn't talk about it. And so confidential, gender sensitive, age appropriate. And so particularly focusing on pre-primary students and learners with disabilities, recognizing that those early experiences of bullying can have profound effects later in life, thinking of ways to allow 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds to safely, confidentially feel comfortable speaking up. And that students, that whatever mechanism, have a tool so that students know that their complaints are being listened to and responded to. So in other words, there's a complete feedback loop that they can, when they do make a complaint or raise an issue or whatever, there is some way of getting back to them and saying, I've heard you and I've done this about it. Is that sufficient? And so on. And so it's more of a dialogue.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, definitely all what you mentioned is something we have observed in the evidence, not just for bullying affecting children with disabilities, but for, reporting mechanisms for any children in terms of any child, in terms of confidentiality, being gender sensitive, being age appropriate. There's a question about smaller classrooms assisting anti-bullying. So this is about bullying prevention in general, but in the case of learners with disabilities, have you observed that small groups, small classrooms are definitely more, a way to provide a safer learning environment and to prevent bullying?
It's a good question, and I can't say for sure. I don't know that I saw anything in the literature, but I would say that any kind of a setting that enables teachers to pay more attention, because that's part of the problem. If teachers aren't responding and can't actually do something when bullying happens because there's 40 students or 50 students or what have you in a classroom, that's going to be a problem and allow bullying to become a spiral. So you can see the advantages of small classrooms in that sense.
Thanks. So now we have lots of questions coming. So we'll take like another 3 or 4 questions, because then we'll need to move to the second part. So another very interesting question, it's about whether actually you found that bullying is limited to students with disabilities, or whether it happened with the whole school community, teachers, staff with disabilities, and whether there's a link with the overall ethos of the school in terms of promoting inclusion or not.
So I think that goes right to that issue of school culture. And so where there is a school culture that is inclusive, there is evidence that there's less likely to be bullying of any student by any person. And so, and conversely, where there is not attention to creating an inclusive environment, we did see evidence that teachers are perpetrators of bullying against students with disabilities, as well as non-disabled students and peers and students with disabilities among each other. And so creating that inclusive environment, I think, is a really important thing.
So the inclusive environment is not just for learners, it's really the whole school. When we talk about whole school approach, all education approach, in this case, inclusion is for everyone in the school. Another interesting question, and will be, perhaps we'll take another one, but this is, that will be, if not the last one. So that's about, do you have any insight on the case of normalized abusive environments at schools, in which you may have the whole structure of teachers and students perpetrating bullying behaviors? And so that's the first question. And then any strategies you may recommend to start with, apart from identifying factors which contribute to this and starting a conversation at the school. So that's good, because the presentation you gave focused on bullying, but it's true that in the report, we also talk a lot about violence perpetrated by teachers, not just bullying perpetrated by peers. So could you respond to this idea, this issue of normalization of violence or bullying, and then any strategies?
I think there is evidence of that it is a significant issue, and I think it is not necessarily only limited to school settings. So, for example, in much of the research that has been done in Uganda among students with disabilities, the evidence shows that those students, in fact, all students, had been exposed to violence from a very early age. And so, in other words, nearly very, very high percentages of the entire school population had experienced violence. And then within the school settings, students with disabilities were continuing to experience violence. And so, in other words, violence had been normalized in a much broader communal sense. How to prevent that? I think it's, again, this goes back to this idea of creating an inclusive school culture. Where does that begin? That begins with potentially with school leadership, but it does also need to extend beyond just the school setting. It's within the school, but it includes working with parents of non-disabled children, as well as parents with children with disabilities, community leaders. One step that I would strongly recommend is for schools to reach out to organizations of persons with disabilities in their region. And among some of the stakeholders that we spoke to, the young gentleman who is an advocate for students with albinism visits schools, and he talks about what his own experiences have been like as a young man growing up with albinism and then out in the professional world. And he's speaking not only to the students with albinism in his audience, but also to the entire school and students, non-disabled students in that school setting. And so familiarizing students with disabilities, students about disability and disability stigma, ways you can do that through curriculum development, creating transformative curriculum that focus on transforming social norms around disability, reducing stigma, representing people with disabilities as agents, as empowered, as important in the stories and materials that students read, and so on. There's a lot of different strategies that one can use to reduce stigma and discrimination in the broader sense that can only help reduce bullying.
Thanks a lot, Megan. I mean, thanks to you and Shishin for really the very, very informative presentation. And I'm going to say a few words, and thanks to people for all your very interesting questions. Now I'm going to say a few words on the report, where you can find the data that was presented. Well, I mean, most of the data that was presented by Megan, especially by Megan, and also the qualitative data that was presented by Shishin. So today we actually launch this new technical brief. You can see the cover page on the screen. So this includes the findings that were presented by Megan on bullying, but as I mentioned, the literature review covered other forms of school violence, not just bullying between peers, which means that we also have data on violence perpetrated by teachers against students. So you can access the data through the link which is shared in the chat box, or you can scan the QR code which is on the slide. And I just want to mention that in the coming months there will be 4 additional versions of the technical brief in other languages: Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish. So you just have to watch the UNESCO website, and you will see these different versions, language versions, coming until the end of this year. So now we're going to move to the second part of this meeting, which is the panel discussion. So we discussed a lot student participation, empowerment as one of the strategies to prevent and address bullying. And today we wanted to also look at the issue of student participation, or participation of learners with disabilities, young people with disabilities, in research. So we have 3 panelists in this session, And I will request that they kindly switch on the cameras, and I will introduce them now. So we have Dr. Mark Carew. Dr. Mark Carew is a senior researcher at the leading disability charity Leonard Shisher, based in the UK. And Mark has expertise with global disability research, which includes stigma and discrimination, inclusive education, participatory research methodologies. He has published several articles, including the co-authored book titled Disability and Sexual Health. And Mark Carew was named on the 2019 and 2020's Power 100 list. So the Power 100 list recognizes the top 100 most influential people with disabilities in the UK. Our second panelist is Kiki Namuya. He's a disability rights activist in Zambia. So he's been living with hereditary visual impairment since birth. He obtained a bachelor's degree in special education from the University of Zambia in 2017. From the University of Zambia, sorry. And in 2017, he became a citizen reporter when he was 25 for a program which is conducted by the NGO Leonard Shisher. And this program is called the 2030 and Counting Program. And in Zambia and other countries in that region, the program aimed to highlight the experiences of youth with disabilities in order to identify gaps in SDG implementation, and also to call for age-appropriate and disability-inclusive policies. And Kiki has been teaching in a special school since 2019, and is a member of youth-led organizations of persons with disabilities, which is called Youth Action for Disability Inclusion Zambia, YADIS. And finally, our third panelist is Associate Professor Kathy Vaughan. She's the head of the Gender and Women's Health Unit and the co-director of the Center for Health Equity at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. And Kathy has extensive experience leading participatory and inclusive research with young people, including young people with disabilities, which is, of course, one of the reasons why she's here today. She also leads research on violence against women, including women with disabilities. And she has particular expertise in the use of visual participatory research methods. So can I ask you to switch on your cameras, please? And we're going to start the conversation. So Mark, Kiki, Kathy, would like to see you on the screen. Yes, I can see you now. So just to start to give a bit of a background, we recognize that participation and inclusion in research are not new concepts and practices in social science. Thanks to participatory research, other innovative ways to approach research, people who used to be only those being researched now have been increasingly involved in data collection, data analysis, design of studies, and this also applies to populations who are considered as disempowered. We also know that research on issues related to youth has been also trying to involve young people as much as possible, and that is not just so that research is not only conducted by adults. However, because of the many prejudices that society has in relation to disabilities, including the research community, many people may still think that people with disabilities and especially young people with disabilities can't do research precisely because of their disabilities. So I would like you to give us concrete examples based on your experience of how young people living with disabilities can be involved in research, including research on discrimination, exclusion, violence, including bullying. And Professor Kathy Vaughan, I would like to start with you. So you've been conducting all this participatory and inclusive research with young people with disabilities. So can you please tell us about one of the studies you conducted and about what was specific in terms of how young people with disabilities were involved at the different stages of their research, data collection, data analysis, all the stages, if there was anything specific. So please, over to you to give us one example.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with so many people. It's evening for me, so for tonight for me. And I want to, before I respond to your question, just to congratulate Unesco and the team in the launch of the report. It's great to see all that data pulled together, both the qualitative and the quantitative data. So I really look forward to reading that further. And I just also want to, as is a tradition in Australia, to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land that I am living on, and to acknowledge their elders. So in response to your question around disability and inclusive research with people with disability, my experience is mixed, working with young adults with disability around experiences of discrimination in public places, and in particular in relation to employment settings, but also research with young women and older women with disability around sexual and reproductive health and around violence. And I suppose I'll draw on the second example around sexual and reproductive health and violence to answer your question, which was the project I'm going to talk about was based in the Philippines, and it was working with people with a range of different types of disability or impairments around what they thought were the priority sexual and reproductive health issues for them, and what they thought could be done to protect women with disability and young women with disability from experiences of violence. And so the project was based on, the actual question was based on the priorities of a number of national disabled people's organisations in the Philippines. And so I think that's the first thing with participatory and inclusive research is establishing the question and making sure that it's relevant for people with disability and for in this instance, young people with disability. Then we did a lot of I guess getting to know each other work, both with the research team from Australia, the researchers who are university-based researchers in the Philippines, disabled people's organisations and members of different activist organisations with disability, and sexual and reproductive health and violence response workers in the Philippines, all coming together as a research team. And that getting to know you process was really important to really, it actually illuminated a lot of prejudice that everyone held about the other. So it may have been that formally trained researchers might have been sceptical that people with disabilities could be researchers. It may have been around the issue of sexual and reproductive health, with people in different groups having different views around sexual and reproductive health, and that coming together was the essential starting point so that people could agree on the research priority and the appropriate way to answer those research questions. And from that, we then held training, and it really was quite intensive training, so that people with disability, in this case, young women with disability, could be able to be part of the team conducting a household survey, but also were doing in-depth qualitative work where they were doing interviews with other people with disability and focus group discussions. then the next way that people with disability were involved in the project was around analysis and interpretation of the data. And thank heavens they were, because the insights that we got from the team in the Philippines with disability was so much richer than it would have been if it had been just taken off to some academic environment and analysed by researchers, because they really could interpret what the kind of unspoken subtext is often there in interviews and focus group discussions. And then the people with disability who were part of the team led the dissemination of those findings and the activism that resulted because of the work that we did. So I guess in terms of why the question, your question of why involving young people with disability is important, it meant that the research we were conducting actually was grounded in real experience and therefore was relevant to people's actual lives, not what we assumed people's experience would be, and therefore was much more likely to be able to bring about change in a context like the Philippines. In terms of what was specific and what we needed to do to make sure the disability, the research was inclusive of young people with disability, it was largely around ensuring that we had the skills and the resources to be inclusive. And so it was things like always having sufficient budget for Filipino Sign Language interpreters, always getting materials to people ahead of time who had visual impairments, who were using electronic readers, for example, always holding our trainings in accessible venues, providing accessible transport, and managing the timing of the process to ensure that people's fatigue level, because fatigue and pain was a significant challenge for some of our team, and so we couldn't hold things over really prolonged periods of time, and we needed to have lots of breaks and so on. And all of that has implications for budget, and I think that the commitment really has to be genuine. You have to resource that work. But I feel like I might be talking too much. I know we've got a number of panelists.
I mean, I just noticed, I mean, lots of very interesting information. I mean, you definitely described a project where people with disabilities were involved at many different stages of the research, design, data collection, data analysis, dissemination of the findings. And you said something very important about what is specific is the need for skills and resources, including human resources, but also financial resources to make sure that research is inclusive. So now I would like to turn to Dr. Mark Carroll, who has also a lot of experience. And Mark, could you tell us about an example of something, a project you also conducted, and also in terms of this, what is specific? I mean, perhaps to build on what Kathy just explained. Over to you, Mark.
Sure, thank you, Christophe. I also think when I'm approaching participatory disability research, and especially with youth with disabilities, I find it really useful to keep in my head about why it's important, and it's so important to involve youth with disabilities in research because of the human rights approach to disability, which is that people with disabilities have the right to participate in all development efforts as active members of communities. And people often think about research and evidence generation as merely contributing to that end goal of inclusive development. But in fact, our research practice is part and parcel of inclusive development itself. So we as researchers, we are active actors that must take responsibility to ensure that the research process is accessible and inclusive to all communities. And Kathy has raised some great points about how we specifically can do that. And I will now talk about a specific a recent example from my work at Leonard Cheshire. So we always take the approach to conduct research that is participatory across what we call the life cycle of evidence generation. So it's participatory right from design to dissemination. So we've just done a research project called Crisis Talks, which looked at youth with disabilities' experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and how they would like to contribute to the national pandemic response. And so we worked with organizations of persons with disabilities as co-researchers who collected lived experience story data across 5 countries, and that was from over 500 participants. And so our core approach was to co-create the research design with the youth with disabilities themselves. So for instance, for each of the country contexts, the youth with disabilities set the research questions and specific methodologies to access the lived experience data for each country context. Now, to add a specific example of how a specific action by which research can be made inclusive, I've actually found that a really useful starting point is to question assumptions by talking directly to the participant communities at the outset of the project. So actually what I would say that even if you already have a very strong paradigm of inclusive research that you think is strong from previous projects, to actually go back at the outset of a new project and question those assumptions and ask whether the new participant groups have anything to add and to change to the paradigm. And I also think along with that a space for reflection at the conclusion of research projects is so important. It's really, I think, important to reflect on what worked and what didn't, because that also contributes to the inclusivity of future research projects. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that I heard some very, very important points. I mean, like in the example provided by Kathy, we clearly see that young people with disabilities are not just there to collect data. I mean, they can be definitely involved in research design, and you said something very interesting about questioning assumptions, which is the kind of the starting research. I mean, so I think, and also what you said about Kathy mentioned analysis, and here you were talking about conclusion of research, discussing what worked. And we will go back to this when we talk about bullying. And you said something also very interesting that resonates with what Megan was presenting a few minutes ago in terms of bullying prevention, is that research is part and parcel of inclusion of people with disabilities. And I think it's the same with anti-bullying interventions. I mean, if young people with disabilities are not involved in those interventions, there's no inclusion. So I think that's really resonates what you explained in terms of research with the overall discussion on how to prevent bullying and violence in general. So now we would like to hear from Kiki, who has a first-hand experience as a young person with disability. He was, as I explained before, involved in research conducted by Leonard Schicher in this 2030 and counting program that I mentioned when I introduced Kiki Namuya. So Kiki, can you tell us a bit more about your experience in conducting the research? I mean, did you feel that there were specific challenges in conducting the research? And if there were challenges, how did you overcome them? I mean, as an individual or working with other people? So Kiki, over to you. I think you are muted. We can't hear you. You are muted. We can't hear you. So we're going to try to help Kiki fixing the problem, the technology. And while we are fixing the problem, don't worry, we'll get back to you. Perhaps I'll go back to Kathy and Mark to discuss the specific issue of bullying and research on bullying. So you said something important also, Mark. You said when we do research, and when we do research involving young people with disabilities, we need to focus on the why. Why is it important? So in this case, if we conduct research on bullying involving young people in disabilities, why can it make a difference? And especially in terms of the quality of the data that is collected, and also perhaps in terms of the impact for policies and programs based on the evidence collected. So perhaps I'll start with Mark, and then we'll move to Kathy, and then hopefully we'll try to reconnect with Kiki Namuya. So over to you, Mark.
Sure, thanks, Christophe. So I think in regards to how research on bullying can make a difference, I think it's important to keep in mind that youth with disabilities, of course, are not a homogeneous group. They're a large and diverse population, so many individuals will possess multiple intersecting identities. And so when we're involving youth with disabilities in research, we're learning from the range of expertise that this community possesses, and that's central to our role as agents ensuring that no one gets left behind, and we implement the human rights approach to disability. But in terms of the actual research, it's also benefiting the research by helping us understand the diversity of experience that this community possesses. So it's helping the research be more accurate from an intersectional lens. And I think that, of course, was something that was flagged as an area of attention in the research report. And I think I would add, secondly, some of the highlights of the findings of the report for me was that there's a need to identify effective bullying interventions, and that also means that we need to be looking at new areas that are emerging, such as cyberbullying. And to look at a question of effectiveness, we need, among other things, we need a relevant outcome measures. So, for instance, for cyberbullying, do we look at only measuring instances on social media platforms, or do we need to look at other places as well, such as gaming platforms and so on? And I think another finding that came out of the report was that a lot of this research is concentrated in North America and Europe. So especially for other regions, we just don't know the answer to these questions. And it's youth with disabilities as experts by experience and as co-researchers that are best placed to help us ensure that our interventions and our responses are meaningful and practical. And that goes for the consequent development in policies as well. So if youth with disabilities are not involved in the very policy solutions that affect them, this ultimately risks that the policies developed do not address their needs. And I think that the testimonies, and we've seen some wonderful examples today, they offer such a powerful complement to the traditional forms of data like statistics, so powerful contextualization of statistics. So we know that youth with disabilities are more likely to be bullied, but what does this mean for someone's lived day-to-day experience? It's been said that every statistic has a person, a story behind it. So these data complement the tradition, the story data complements the statistical data and what have you that gets provided to policymakers, and they effectively raise more attention to the issue and encourage action. And I think a final point, and I think Kiki and others can speak to this better than me, is that I would hope that youth involvement in bullying research is also empowering for the participants, that it brings confidence that, for example, bullying is something that is not immovable. It is something that can be overturned, because we as researchers, we should of course always be striving to make sure that we have not only good outcomes at the macro societal level, but also at the very communities that the research is conducted in. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I'm going to check if we can connect again with Kiki Namuya, or if we still have a connection problem. I can't see Kiki on the screen. So, I mean, in the meantime, okay, so, Kiki is there, but I can't hear his voice. It's not working. It seems that we have a problem with the mic. So let's try again. My colleagues will be helping. So just to go back to what Mark Carew said, I mean, there are a few things that I noted. I mean, there's the involving young people with disabilities in research on bullying. It's getting data on the diversity of experience. I mean, it's for example, at UNESCO, very often we advocate for student participation in anti-bullying interventions. But then we explain to ministries of education that if within these students who are involved in the interventions, there's no diversity, then there's no chance that the most vulnerable children will be protected. So I think, and also what you said, I think is really interesting. We see that it's not a homogeneous group. So when you say involving young people with disabilities in research, it means involving many kinds, many categories of young people with disabilities in research, because there are so many types of disabilities. And also what you said about research and involvement in these interventions being an empowerment process, which I think is also very interesting. So Kathy, just to go back to the question, while we're waiting to reconnect with Kiki Namuya, in terms of this question on the impact of involving young people with disabilities in research on bullying, what are your views on this?
I think that an inclusive approach is absolutely essential to any research on bullying, partly because of, as Mark said, it's the right of people with disability to be involved in research that's about their lives and that, in which they've got the most at stake. But also, when you think about the history of research with people with disability, it's often been quite exploitative and extractive. So researchers taking data, taking information from people with disability about their lives, which there's so many parallels with the act of bullying and the process of taking power away from someone. And so to try and count, I think of all the topics, it's so important that research on bullying is inclusive and participatory, because it needs to involve handing, or equalising power between researchers and the community that they're researching with, in this case, young people with disability, to try and run counter to that history of extraction and disempowerment that research is often involved. And a participatory kind of inclusive approach to research has the potential to build the skills of people with disability, the confidence of young people with disability, both for them as individuals. As Mark said, you can definitely see individual empowerment and benefit with people developing skills and knowledge and confidence and networks that they didn't have before, but also as a collective in terms of advocating for their rights, advocating for safer schools, advocating for interventions about bullying. And also, a participatory and inclusive approach really needs to also create a forum where young people with disability are able to speak and be respected for their expertise in their own lives. They're the experts in what it's like to be a young person with a disability and to experience bullying. And it's really the responsibility of research teams to bring together people who are decision makers and who are in positions of power to listen to that. And to hear what young people with disability have to say to try and bring about change in relation to bullying that young people with disability experience. So I think, you know, for this particular topic, it's even more essential that research approaches are inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, you said something I really like, that the fact that bullying is about power imbalance.
Yeah.
And research is about empowering these young people with disabilities, and this kind of this power imbalance can be kind of addressed through this empowerment process, and also research as being a way for young people with disabilities to advocate for safe schools, for safe learning environments. So that's thank you for these thoughts. I mean, for me, it's really enlightening. I mean, things I didn't think about before, I mean, conceptually. So I see Kiki. Can we hear you? Kiki Namuya? Unfortunately, I can see him, but we can't hear him. So is there a way we can call him? Or in the meantime, perhaps there are people who would like, who have reflections on the discussion. I mean, people who are also involved in research. We're still trying to connect with Kiki Namuya, but in the meantime, are there any questions or reactions to what we just discussed in terms of involvement of young people with disabilities? Perhaps there are young people with disabilities who are involved, in this meeting and who would like to share their experiences. So we're ready, we have a bit of time. I mean, hoping that we will be able to connect with Kiki Namuya. I mean, it worked perfectly just before the meeting, so it's unfortunate. So do we have any questions? I'm looking in the Q&A. Okay, no. So we have basically 2 minutes left. And then if we manage to reconnect with Kiki, we'll still give him a space because he has very, very interesting things to share. We had a chance to talk to him, and obviously he's been working with Leonard Schuster. So, but I mean, it's important that he can talk about his own experience. So if we don't have any, I'm looking at the questions. So my colleagues just tell me that he's reconnecting. I mean, otherwise, just for the sake of time, we will listen to someone who is very, very important. I can see you again. Kiki, can you speak and can we hear you? No, it seems that there's still a problem with the connection. It's really unfortunate. I'm checking. My colleagues are trying to call him on the phone. Okay, so just for the sake of time, I mean, if he can reconnect, we'll just give him some time to speak. But I mean, we need to be a bit flexible. So I would like to introduce someone who is also very important for concluding remarks. We'll see if Kiki comes back, then we'll have him again. So we will see. I mean, Mark and Kathy, perhaps you'll come back after these concluding remarks. Otherwise, we'll just conclude. And I just want to thank you a lot, because for me, your thoughts were really very, very enlightening. So, as I said, now someone very important. She's the special envoy of the UN Secretary General on Disability and Accessibility, Professor Maria Soledad Cisternas Reyes. For those of you who don't know her yet, I'm going to introduce her briefly. So prior to her current role, Professor Sisterra Reyes chaired the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities between 2013 and 2016. And in recognition, she's a lawyer, she's a researcher, she's a law professor, and in recognition of her work as a lawyer, as a law professor and researcher, she was also the recipient of the 2014 National Human Rights Award in Chile. She's from Chile. So, Professor Sisterra Reyes, we're going to listen to you now for their concluding remarks. Por favor.
Muchas gracias por...
Many thanks. Many thanks for UNESCO's inviting me. Thank you, Christophe. And first of all, I would like to point out something very important from the standpoint and in the framework of all the things we've been talking about in terms of human rights. When we talk about bullying, we're talking about an attack on human rights at the end of the day. And here we need to be aware of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We all know that people have to have their personal identity respected and their abilities as children to be respected. But the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Handicap, with terms of human rights in the 21st century, what we see today is the applicable model for persons living with handicaps is about disability rights being human rights. And this is something very important that we need to bear in mind. Because when you're dealing with a person living with a handicap, this isn't a deficiency, rather, it's a multifocal concept which sums up the different barriers and restrictions which apply to the full and effective participation of that person in society. And when we talk about bullying, we're talking precisely about these barriers which make it hard for people fully and effectively to participate in their societies. And so with this human rights focus, students who are experiencing bullying are suffering for attacks on their personal integrity, mainly psychologically, in some cases also physically, and sometimes also their sexual integrity. But they're also suffering from an attack on their personal identity. And the principle of the convention says that the higher interest of the child or the adolescent living with a handicap, but there's also an impact, as Bernelli said, and I was very pleased to hear that eyewitness account, is a trauma which impacts the whole rest of the person's life, and for that reason also affects the person's right to be included in the community and to be able to live independently. From another standpoint, bullying is truly a situation of bullying, of violence, of harassment, which is decried by the convention. And it can also be a form of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And this is the highest level that we're talking about that can be assimilated to a case of torture. And I'm not exaggerating here, because just as we've said that students with handicaps are most likely to experience bullying, this same bullying will be stronger, have greater impact, will be subjectively considered to be of even greater proportion, if you will, by the students who experience it. And so in the case of bullying as well, there is discrimination, as we said in the opening of this event. There is a form of discrimination which implies restrictions that are based on a person's handicap and that are carried out so as to make it more difficult for a person to be recognized or for them to be able to exercise their fundamental human rights. And I think that this is something we cannot afford to lose sight of. Here, what is of interest of us, the discrimination as defined in the convention, is that it does not talk about the intention or the result. There can be either just the invention or just the result. When it's done on purpose, as we say with an attempt to bring about this illegal conduct through language, for instance, we often see that people who are perpetrators of bullying may be legal minors and then may not have criminal sanctions applied to them. But nonetheless, we are dealing with a situation of illegality, even if the persons who do this cannot be accused of crimes because of their age. That being said, I'd also like to point out something else that we should not forget. We are looking at a sustainable development agenda, an agenda that talks about well-being of people of all ages. And we also talk about inclusive, quality, lifelong learning. And one of the challenges here is precisely to meet our goal for learning, and in particular with a gender focus. And here we've seen how much bullying increases when we look at young women or teenagers who are living with handicaps. So when we're in this context, it seems to me enormously relevant, the research that we've seen with the space of literature, but also with eyewitness accounts. And it's also tremendously important for conclusions. I would like to bring out this idea. We've heard from the different presenters that information is basically to be found more commonly in more developed countries. I belong to the global south myself. And precisely when we talk about the literature and the data and the statistics that exist in the global south, we can extrapolate that if this type of violation of rights exists in the more developed countries, let us imagine to what greater extent it may exist in developing countries, when consciousness is something that needs to have been worked on very intensely, because there are other more priority factors sometimes that crowd this out. For instance, poverty. And when you look at poverty and handicap together, it becomes a vicious circle that we have to break. And so when we talk about bullying, we're also talking about intersectional bullying, which influences when we're talking about situations of handicap or of poverty or of being a child, especially a girl. This further increases the impact of this bullying. So to come back to the presentation, I think the conclusions that we heard are very relevant. And I think especially in terms of bringing about a culture of inclusion and participation, a culture which is part of the ethics that we see in a school context. And so this creation of culture, participatory and inclusive culture, the language used in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Handicaps, Article 8, talks about awareness, leading to elimination of stereotypes, of prejudices, and of harmful practices, eliminating, or rather bringing out the merits, capacities, and abilities of persons living with handicaps, in this case, when they are students. Secondly, when we look at this culture of inclusion and participation, obviously the whole educational sector, the whole context of schools, when dealing with students with or without handicaps, teachers, management, all school personnel, administrators, everyone has to be involved in this awareness. And this is very important for research projects, as you all have correctly pointed out, the participation of handicapped students, so as to arrive at this degree of empoweredness, but also to have students without handicaps who are those who perpetuate these situations of bullying. Why is that? Because they are also shown the focal point of a social illness that must be healed or cured if we wish to uproot bullying, eliminate it. But there are people who are being bullied, but there are others who are in a supposed position of power who are perpetuating bullying. But these people themselves are also suffering from an illness that has to be treated. Otherwise, the bullying will just be deviated from one person to another. Then thirdly, the role of teachers. Here, we've talked about this as well. I've also done work on this subject. And the role of teachers is of fundamental importance in those schools where teachers don't even necessarily have to have systematic knowledge, but to have empathy and common sense and try to prevent and eradicate different forms of bullying, then there will be less bullying in that school. So the leadership role the teachers play here is of fundamental importance. And so the initial training and continued training of teachers and also specific practitioner practice play an important role. There are many, many other things I could say, but I can see that I have exhausted the time I have for speaking. And I would like to conclude simply by pointing out that all this work needs to be oriented in some direction, obviously, to schools and educational institutions, universities, where teachers are being trained and other school professionals are trained, training for the whole teaching system, but also the government. It's very important that this be considered to be something that the government needs to be dealing with, a subject for public policy, particularly in ministries of education, but other ministries as well, so that they create this link, a network with all the different working networks for teachers at all the different levels of education. And then let me also conclude by saying that we cannot forget what I call structural bullying. Structural bullying exists for students who are handicapped. And here I should also refer to the lack of accessibility in all its different forms in terms of physical access, information, communication, technology, and also the lack of reasonable redress. When you look at the convention, which talks about discrimination based on handicap status, they say that one form of discrimination is the lack of reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments are of fundamental importance in schools. And so please let us not forget this. When we study this matters, structural bullying, the lack of accessibility and the lack of reasonable adjustments or accommodation as basic elements of an intersectoral public policy. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for this. These were really very concluding remarks. So I just want to thank all the speakers. I mean, I think that we had data, we had lots of food for thought. I mean, and I also want to thank the team who prepared this meeting, the interpreters, obviously. And I mean, unfortunately, we couldn't connect with Kiki Namuya. We'll try to post a message on our website so he has a chance to share his experience. So thanks a lot for your participation. Please read the report, go to the UNESCO website. If you need another language version, it will come soon. So thanks a lot. And we'll have another meeting on disabilities in September. It will be on the role of teachers in preventing and addressing, another meeting on bullying. It will be on the role of teachers in preventing and addressing bullying. Thanks a lot. Bye. Have a good day or have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. You may stop recording now. Thank you all.